really excited to have this one coming up. And actually, this guy is a person that I know, awesome dude, because he is one of the other folks that's actually spearheading one of the other Google developer groups here in Toronto, the Toronto Android one. So really cool that we could have the opportunity to have him join us all the way from Toronto. Coming to talk to us about how the command line can give you superpowers from Shopify. Please, warm round of applause for Eric Fung.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for that warm welcome, Mark. My name is Eric Fung. I work at Shopify here in our Toronto office. I did Android for about 8 years. I recently moved to data science. But today, I want to talk to you about how the command line can give you superpowers. My Twitter handle is there if you want to say nice things or give constructive feedback. Feel free to take photos of the slides, but I will make a copy of them available afterward that has clickable links for all the tools. I want to cover a lot of stuff, so it's going to go pretty fast. Command line. What do you think of when you hear the command line? Just think about it for a second in your mind. Do you have something in your mind? First, you might think, well, why am I talking about that at an Android conference? Do you think of this? Do you think of an old monochrome or maybe 16-color CRT, 80 columns? Do you think of this? Do you think of MS-DOS? Maybe use that in the 90s. Maybe using its successor, PowerShell now. I usually think of this. This is my first experience with Shell and Bash. With Linux, and even though I don't use Linux anymore and use macOS, it's still got those shells. Maybe you're using it right now. I'm hoping this talk will still be useful to you, teach you something that you didn't know about already. If you used ADB recently, you've probably used the shell to send commands to the remote shell that's sitting on your Android device or emulator. So command line interfaces are very much still around. And our favorite messaging app, Slack, you've probably used a command line to interact with it also. So what I mean by command line interface is a way of an interface that is primarily text-oriented so that you can give commands to a computer. For non-technical users, and regular computer users 20 years ago, this used to be the primary way that you interacted with a computer. We didn't have touch or voice interfaces before. Why are these interfaces still around? We have better ways to interact now, don't we? In my opinion, the reason for their longevity is that they offer capabilities, especially for developers, that are unmatched by our current tools. So why would you want to use the command line, or why do I use the command line? Command line, to me, is no frills. There's no drop-down menus. There's no slick animations. There's no sound effects. It's just text in and text out. It's efficient. It's to the point. Nothing gets in your way of getting something done. Command line tools usually have more customizable options than their GUI counterparts. This gives you more ways to solve your problems. You can take those individual tools and compose them in different ways to solve your problems. And I always feel that the more tools you have in your tool belt, the more likely it is that you'll be able to solve your problem. You've probably heard this from your mom or your dad that, use the right tool for the job. If you're familiar with the Perl community, they're fond of the acronym TIM-TOADY, which stands for there is more than one way to do it. And command line tools give you all those different ways. This isn't working. The command line also helps you do a variety of tasks that you might be called on to do beyond what you think of as an Android developer. You might have to do things like manipulate images. You might have to do things like deal with remote APIs, interpreting data. Command line tools aren't just for Android developers, and they certainly weren't developed way before Android was around. And best of all, command line tools are transferable, right? The skills that you invest in on the command line can be used in all kinds of other domains as well. So I mentioned superpower in the title. It's just kind of a fun thing. I'm not a big Marvel fan, but people often say when they look at what you're doing on the command line, they say, whoa, how did you do that? Or, whoa, what just happened there? Because it seems like a superpower to them if they don't know what it's about. So this is a really silly list of superpowers. It's an ambitious list to cover in 30 minutes, so we're just going to go through all of them. I want to show you how to type less. I want to show you how to navigate really quickly in the file system, how to find things on your computer, how to use remote APIs easily, how to slice and dice your data, how to even work with devices without even having to touch them. So my goal here is to just sort of scratch the surface of the power that command line tools can give you, open up the world that is out there. And my hopeful takeaway for you is that you'll benefit from my experience. You'll learn some of the names of the tools so you can dig into them some more and then adapt them for your own needs. So let's start with the basics. We need to know about 3 things anytime we're working with the command line: the terminal, the shell, and the package manager. So a terminal comes from back in the day when people used to work with computers against a mainframe that had all the brains, and your terminal was just this little CRT that could just display the text, interpret control characters, and show it to you. Nowadays, we have a piece of software that runs on our computer that displays that text. The shell is a program that runs to execute commands that you enter, and it gives you access to operating system services like peripherals and the disk. It can launch programs that are built in or launch programs that you install onto the disk. And the way to install programs is via package manager. You can think of it just like the Mac App Store for apps, the Play Store for your Android phone. It's a utility to install more software on your computer and to manage what's installed. Now, this is an opinionated list, but if you haven't gotten much experience with command line before, this is a good starting point. macOS comes with a terminal app. I'd say just put it aside and install iTerm 2. It's got a lot more features. There's a new release every other week. Plenty of ways to customize it and to make it work for you. I've listed 3 of my favorite features there that I use all the time. The shell that comes with your Mac by default for users is called Bash. It's the born-again shell. It's widely used, which means there's a ton of blog posts. There's a ton of documentation about it, so you'll have lots of help. If you've used the shell before, you might have your own favorite, but I'm going to use this one in all the examples. You might want to install a newer version. The one that comes with macOS is pretty outdated. And to do that, you can use a package manager. Homebrew is one of the more popular ones. It manages thousands of packages that you can install onto your Mac, many of them ported over from the Linux or Unix worlds. And it's something that I'm going to be referencing. Almost all the software I'm going to talk about is available through Homebrew. Right, so I promised I'd show you how to type less. So if you think about command line, you might think, ugh, it's just keyboard, keyboard, keyboard. I can't use click. I can't just point. But you don't have to type so much. There is something called tab completion, which is built into Bash. The support for that is built in. But you have to install a base package to get completion for many of your popular macOS commands. What it does is that as you type a little bit of a command and hit tab, it completes it with what's available. It not only completes command names, but it'll complete option names, like sub-commands or options, and even option values, depending on the completion that's available. So you can actually get completion for ADB. So there's a ton of little sub-commands. I've listed 4 of them here: install, uninstall. But I never remember all the different arguments for it, because the tool only gets more and more features. So when I mention context sensitivity, I mean that ADB install, for example, when you hit tab after you type install, it will only show you APKs, because that's the only thing that makes sense to do with ADB install. Similarly, with uninstall, when you type uninstall, it will only show you the package names, com.android or com.example, well, whatever. It understands completing option value. So the global -S option allows you to specify the serial number or the emulator if you have more than one connected to your computer, so you can send ADB commands to that one. So it will know if you hit tab on that, it will complete. So you don't have to cut and paste that or memorize what that is. So let's look at a little example of what that looks like. So if I type ADB here, and then -S, I hit tab, and it has completed with both a emulator and a physical device that I have connected. And I just need to type a few characters of that, and then it will complete the rest. And then after I hit uninstall and hit a bit of a package name and tab, it will actually complete with the rest of the available apps that were on that emulator image. So that's a really handy feature for ADB. Now, when we're working with macOS, you're not going to stay in the command line the whole time. You still have the Finder. But there are some tools that come with macOS that make it much easier to work with a Finder. And so one of them is built into macOS. It's called Open. As you might expect, it does some sort of open. And you can think of it as whatever you pass as an argument, it's like double-clicking on it in the Finder. So if you pass it an application name, it will actually launch that application. If you pass it an image file, it will open it in preview. One super handy way I use Open is to pass dot. That just means open a Finder window with a current directory in it. Going the other direction, you can actually take stuff from the Finder and put it back into the terminal, into your shell. So if you just drag and drop a file from the terminal, it will paste the full path to that file, correctly escaped special characters, spaces, so that you can use it as an argument to your command line. So one way I use this is I have a folder here with a whole bunch of old APKs that you might have for regression testing. When you want to install that onto your device, you can just start typing adb install, then go over and then drag and drop that file right there. It doesn't have to come from your Finder. It could be in your dock. It could be on your desktop, so wherever you like to keep old APKs around. Next, if you've spent any time in a shell, you know moving around can be a bit of a pain. You have to type cd all the time to go into a folder. Quick review of what that looks like. CD, you pass the sort of hierarchical path to where you're going to go down into a folder, and then the dot dots, a whole bunch of them, to go back up. One useful one that is a surprise to many people is that there's an alias for going back to your previous directory. So say you just want to go to another directory temporarily, do something, and come back. CD- lets you do that. Or I find I type the wrong folder all the time. Just out of muscle memory, this is a useful time saver. But what if there's a way that you could go to a folder, like that really deep path, source, main, Java, comp, whatever, without having to type the full path every time? What if we had this magical tool called J, and you just typed a folder name? What happened there? I just typed a piece of that folder name, and we went all the way down into that other folder. Now I'm going to go to a different folder. Blame Google for this really long path here. And then go back with CD-, and then I can now jump to that folder that I just went to do app, and there is more than one match, so this tool gave me a bunch of suggestions, and I can just type the number, prefixing the one that I'm interested in. There are lots of alternative navigation utilities like this. The one I'm demoing here is called Autojump. It gives you fast access to directories that are far away from where you are. Because if it's just one level below, you can just use CD, right? You don't need to use a special tool. But this lets you go all over your file system without having to type in the full path. And it also sorts the directories based on your usage. So the more frequently that you visit a directory, the higher it will bubble up in the list so that we'll know what to jump to. And if there's more than one match, you can always hit tab to complete and choose the one that is the one you're trying to go to. So here's a quick summary of its usage. You can jump to a directory containing that name. You can go to a subfolder containing that name, and also tab complete. I promise you'll be able to search haystacks and find needles. You're familiar with Android Studio Search. Not only can you search all of the code in your project, but you can search all of its settings, all of its commands. Very handy. But often you might want to search things that are not just in your project. Somewhere on your disk. Somebody sent you a file. Somebody sent you an asset. You put it somewhere you don't remember where it was, or something like that. You might turn to grep if you've heard about that utility before. But here's why grep, you should replace grep with something else. So here I'm showing you there's a folder that is 630 megs of Google documentation. I'm going to go look through it and just print out the matches of all the files that contain the word wearable in them. So this is going to run, and run, and run. And the summary here, it took 13 seconds. Too long. Who has time to wait 13 seconds? So we can do better than that. We're going to use a tool here called RG. Same kind of search. We're going to look through and print only the matches. Whoa, much, much faster. That was 0.3 seconds. That is 12 plus seconds you can get back every day if you have to search 600 megs of documentation. RG also has other options. so that you can search for just particular files. So if you know that what you were looking for was in a JavaScript file, you can tell this tool, hey, just restrict it there. If you only know that it was in a CSS file, you can, if you have a hierarchy of mixed files, you can just look in those file types. So this isn't some sort of mythical tool. It actually exists. It's called ripgrep. RG is just the command name that you use. It supports all the grep options that you're used to. So for like show lines of context or just print matches. So it's easy to make the move from grep to RG. It's a lot faster because it has more sensible defaults. Most of the time, you're not looking in binary files, right? You don't want to match .class files. You don't want to match your PNGs. But grep doesn't know about that. It's just a file. It happens to be binary, but it tries to find those matches inside. And it knows about revision control ignore. So whether you're using Git or some other system, you have some sort of ignore file that, by default, ripgrep will parse those. So it knows that if you don't care about your IDE settings, you don't care about .class files and other temporary build files, it's not going to search in those. But if you do want to do that, you're able to do so via a command line option. So remember, I mentioned at the beginning that command line tools have lots of customizable options. And so this is an example of why they're so powerful. And maybe most important, in 2018, ripgrep has proper support for searching for emoji in your files, which some grep replacements don't, which is why I call it out here. One very practical use case I have for text-based search is if you've ever used the Android SDK manager and you've downloaded the Android docs offline, you're like, great, I have a 4-hour flight, I can do a little bit of coding, I have a copy of the docs. Have you ever tried to search the docs while you're offline? It's not going to work because the Android search is an online search only. But that's OK, because we have a copy of the docs and we have a really fast text searcher. So what you can do is you can do a query to search the documentation. And using iTerm here, whatever the results come up, you can just command click on that, and you get a copy of the documentation there. So it's not perfect, but it's better than not having any search at all. Next, I want to talk about dealing with I/O, so getting information in your computer and getting information out. A quick recap. I don't have time to go into all the details. A quick recap of sort of some of the concepts in the shell. There are two streams called standard in and standard out. Streams are, you can think of standard in as where information comes from. So in most cases, by default, information comes from the keyboard, and it gets into your terminal. And information goes out through standard out. By default, it goes and gets printed on your screen. But that's not always that useful. You might get your data from another command, or you might get your data from the internet. So you have these redirection operators, those are the angle brackets, to allow you to send standard out somewhere else, like a file, or read standard in from somewhere else. Instead of the keyboard, it reads from a file. And then pipelines tie all this together by allowing you to chain multiple programs. Remember I mentioned that you can take command line tools and compose them in different ways. So pipelines allow you to take the standard out of one command and feed it into the standard in of another. So if you're familiar with Rx, this is building up a chain of operators. It's exactly the same concept. So one handy way you can use these right away is through two built-in utilities to macOS that help you work with the clipboard. And it says PB there because macOS actually calls it the pasteboard. Think of pbcopy as Command C for the shell. So it takes whatever is in standard in and copies it to the clipboard. So you might want to take a command and pipe it to pbcopy, and whatever that command output is now on your clipboard, you can paste it into a GUI app. And the reverse of that pbpaste, think of it as Command V for the shell. It lets you take whatever was on the clipboard and paste it into the terminal or write it to wherever you want to send standard out and redirect it. All right, I keep mentioning that you're going to deal with remote APIs on the web. I don't use command line to browse the internet anymore. Anybody remember links? But you deal with remote servers all the time, right? And so you want to have a tool to be able to talk HTTP and other internet protocols. So let's look at curl, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. The most basic invocation of it, you just pass it a URL, and then it dumps out the response to standard out. Pretty easy. Slightly more, if you just add one option, we're just going to add the -- include option. This means show me also the response headers. I'm going to use that pipe symbol there to have a look at only the lines that say cache on them. So this is a really fast way to look at the response headers. And not only can you do gets, but you can also do writes too, so do a post. Here I have a file called body that just has some JSON content in it. I'm going to, well, the video is typing, but I'm going to type this whole request to actually post that value into that site, and I get back a successful response. So with just a few options, you have a full-fledged HTTP client at your disposal from the command line. Now, curl is not just for HTTP. It works with a whole bunch of other internet protocols. It is extremely customizable, as its documentation attests to. And it's designed to be unattended. So it'll handle things that you expect it to, like 302 redirects, authentication, all those things. It comes with your Mac. It comes with Windows now, actually. But you should download a newer version from Homebrew to get all the latest features. So this is just a little bit more verbose, seeing what the -- include option did. It will give you the response from the server, if it had any, but also dump the entire set of headers. This is handy for when you want to deal with an API that you haven't used before, to see cache headers or any other kind of extended headers that it's sending. And allows you to play around with requests really easy. You have Postman maybe that you're using in the browser, but that's a lot of fiddling with checkboxes and dropdowns and things. You can save these little one-liners as scripts to reuse over and over again. One other way that I've used it is sending Firebase push notifications. So normally you have your app server set up to send push notifications based on some trigger, like somebody sent a message or somebody posted something. You can send it from the command line. There's documentation on Google's website for Firebase that shows you how to do it. Here's just a quick summary of how you can do that. So this is very useful if you're debugging the UI for your push notifications. We've seen a lot of JSON responses. If you're working with your own server for your own team, your own company, you probably have some sort of spec about what those responses are. But sometimes you work with somebody else's API, and it's not documented, or it's poorly documented, or worse, it's incorrectly documented. It's useful to have tools that can slice and dice JSON. JSON data is very structured, so you want a tool that understands that structure. Here's an example using Flickr, which has a really well-documented API. But if you don't want to read through all that documentation, just get right into it. This is what it sends. It strips all the white space, because that's waste bytes on the wire. You can use a tool to make that a little bit easier to read. We're going to pipe it through this tool here. And what has it done? It's made all that JSON, not just pretty print. This is not pretty printing the JSON. This is no longer valid JSON. But this is now line-oriented JSON. So does anybody know of a utility we can do to do line-oriented searching? Maybe ripgrep? We can now search JSON data really easily and just get exactly the elements that we're looking for. So you see that every object is on its own line. Every value is on its own line. And you can easily see from those array indices, too, exactly which element it comes from. So this tool is called Gron. It turns JSON into line-oriented data. It's very useful when you don't know what that structure of your remote API is. And then you can post-process this data with like grep or some other line-oriented search tool. Here's another look at that, what that output looks like again. Now, what if it's data that you know the structure of? What tools do we have at our disposal for that? So here's a tool that is just pretty printing that JSON response. Lots of tools do this. No big deal here. But what if we want to access a specific element from an array and just give me a summary of just that one value? So here's an example of using this tool. It's called JQ. What I've asked for is, deep inside this structure, I want to get from all these array elements, pull out one of those values and print it in a list. This tool is called JQ. It's a powerful processor that can slice and filter and map and transform your data. It has a very concise syntax. It's almost worse than Perl. But it is well documented. There's a cookbook. There's wiki. There's lots of online support for it. And once you learn it, and I'm still learning it, it can be a really powerful tool to answer questions about JSON data. Here's that example again. So in that Flickr response, there was an object called with a photos key That photo's value was an object itself that had a photo key. And then I want to iterate, that's the dot square brackets. I want to iterate over those array elements and then return all the titles. You can also apply predicates to this data too. So only show me the array elements where the ID is less than 1,000 or something like that. So that's also possible. Let's talk a bit about image manipulation. So this is in the category of things that you might be called on to do outside your regular Android developer work. When you're doing a pull request, if you're doing screen layouts, you often want to show the before and after for your reviewers. You can drag and drop images into GitHub. That's nothing new. But it's nice to put them side by side. I don't know how to use Photoshop. I don't know how to use Sketch or Pixelmator. I don't have licenses to those tools. But I do have access to ImageMagick, which is a suite of command line utilities that's been in development for almost 30 years. It's a really, really old project. Super comprehensive format support, almost 200 image formats. So how can we use ImageMagick to help us make a nicer pull request? Well, here is a before and after of a screen I worked on a couple months ago. And I just want to mash them together. So I wrap this up in a little bash function. But the key components here is that ImageMagick comes with a tool called Montage. It lets you specify the input images. That's what $* is in bash syntax. And the important one here is the montage with a tile, which makes them all in one row and adds a little label based on its file name. And the way you would use this function once you have it defined is to say just side by side, one image after the other, the command line, and you get a nice composite like that. ImageMagick can be used for all kinds of things. All of the background images for each of the sections here, I just passed them all to ImageMagick, and I said darken all of these by 20% and made a nice set of outputs without having to manually do one after the other. They can even programmatically crop images too, which is handy if your designer isn't around and you need to do that across a whole bunch of different densities. All right, I promised 2 more things about not having to touch your device. I think these are the coolest things. Let's just watch what's happening here. I typically debug by plugging in a device through a USB cable, but there are times when you don't have a USB cable, or you have a USB cable and it's not useful, because I'll get to that in a second. So what just happened here? We were able to, well, sorry, let me get to the motivation here. Google actually describes how you can install an APK wirelessly over Wi-Fi. It involves setting up a TCP server. The connection can go down. I'd never bothered because it seems really cumbersome and flaky. I mentioned that you won't always carry a USB cable, and you happen to really urgently need to install an APK onto your device. And I've actually encountered recently a device that didn't allow you to USB load an app unless you signed up for their social networking service. Xiaomi. So in that case, QR file transfer came to the rescue. What this does is it runs a local web server on your computer, serving up any file you want, APK in this case, and generates a QR code pointing to the URL of that file so that you can just scan it and transfer it to your machine. So that's super handy. Last one here is a way to automate testing. So if you need to always log into your app to test it, it might be nice to be able to just automate that. Now you think, oh, you can use a physical keyboard against an emulator. I'm showing an emulator here. But what about a physical device? Right? You can't, unless you have a special machine that can actually type on the virtual keyboard, you can't do that. What this does here is I can script actual interaction with not only emulators, but physical devices too. I'm typing here. I'm clicking on buttons. So the magic behind this, the superpower here, is actually built into ADB. So ADB shell allows you to pass keyboard input as well as touch input to the device through XY coordinates. And you can combine these into a rudimentary script to do a whole flow like login. So in this example, I use Slack. And here's like the full contents of that script. It just takes 3 arguments, the name of the workspace, the email, and the password. Now you look at this and you're like, wait a sec. He's got a hard-coded constant there for sleep. You know, this is really flaky. Yes, it is naive, but it's enough to get the job done, right? Like if you're testing locally against your own server, it's not against a production environment or something like that, it might be good enough. You don't need it to handle all the error states and things like that, but it can save you a ton of time because you're not using that virtual keyboard all the time. All right. In summary, I've showed you a basic command line setup. Hopefully I've shown you how the command line isn't as scary and is more powerful than you might have thought. And you've had sort of a quick survey, a taste of all the tools that are available to help not only in your development, but in design tasks and in debugging tasks that help you get your problems and your things that you need to do as an Android developer, get those things done more quickly. And hopefully this has inspired you to look at command line in more depth too. That's the end. I can be reachable at all these places. Come talk to me if you want to learn more about command line, if you're interested in what we do at Shopify. I blog infrequently, and I'll make a copy of these slides available afterwards. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Hopefully everybody's going to use these superpowers for the forces of good.
Yes, just for
not
good.
Evil.
Never for evil.
But any questions for Eric? One over here.
A great presentation again. I want to know if Q file transfer works for like iOS as well.
The QR file transfer?
Yeah, the QR code one.
As long as it has a QR reader, I think. There's one built into Twitter, which I sometimes use. But I don't know. I would imagine it depends on the security policy on the device, whether you can just download an IPA over the air like that.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. All right, I guess let's have one more round of applause for Eric. Eric, thanks again.